Well, the third largest railroad union rejected a deal from employers, renewing the possibility of a nationwide strike that could hurt the U.S. economy.
That's right. The railroads and unions reached a tentative deal last month to avoid a walkout. And a lot of people were breathing a big sigh of relief. But all 12 unions, representing 115,000 workers, must ratify the contract by the middle of next month. Both sides will now return to the bargaining table. So let's bring in Richard Edelman now. He's a labor attorney for the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees, the union that has rejected this proposed deal. Richard, welcome. Great to have you with us. So explain to us where the disconnect is here between the BWED and the rail companies, because we know that the unions did get a lot of what they were asking for. What does the union still want that employers are not willing to give?
Well, look, I think that what you see is a culmination of trends and events over nearly 2 decades. The railroads have been very, very, very profitable since 2004, but the employees' wage increases have been comparatively minuscule. And as they've taken on increased costs for the health and welfare benefits. And in 2016, the railroads adopted a new, very rigid cost-cutting business model that at the behest of activists, so-called activist investors, and they cut the workforce by 30%. And then came the pandemic, and rail workers were required to work through. BMWE members, many of them had to travel long distances, work in close quarters with coworkers, while managers and administrative people got to stay home. The workforce reductions continued even as the pandemic went on. Even as traffic came back, the workforce reductions continued. And the railroad profits actually increased as the workforce remained stagnant. And in the bargaining, the railroads insisted that their extreme profits were irrelevant to employee compensation and benefits. And the railroads resisted union proposals for paid sick leave. The railroads seemed to recognize a need for it at the start of the pandemic. They unilaterally gave paid sick leave to employees who were infected or exposed to COVID. But they resisted, they would not agree to provide paid sick leave as part of an agreement. And all the while, the profits parade continued. And all of that's really led to where we are now. And the railroad workers feel disrespected and abused. And during the bargaining, we said that the railroads had seen a 1,000% increase in thank yous for your service and a 0% wage increase offer. And in that context, the denial of paid sick leave hits particularly hard. And I think all of that came together and resulted in the rejection of the tentative agreement.
So, Richard, you really sort of painted a good picture. We get it, a 30% reduction in railroad employees, but the work is still there. So you have fewer people doing the same amount of work. As I understand it, sick leave was definitely one of the factors, but it was also this really sort of strict attendance policy that made it very difficult for workers to balance their personal life and their work. And that seemed to me to be sort of at the top of the agenda. So when the president came out and said this is a win for railroad employees, I thought that that would have been a big component of this new tentative deal. Was your union present during the negotiations with the Labor Department? And, did that come up?
So the BMWED was not part of those negotiations at the Department of Labor. And the issue that you've raised is a very significant issue for engineers and conductors who have unscheduled work. In other words, they're almost always on call. And so as a result, they can't even get time to go to a doctor or go to a dentist or deal with some, scheduled surgeries. So that's a significant issue for them. That was one of the things that was addressed that evening, but that was not, BMWED was not part of that.
Okay. So, Richard, many employers afford their employees what you are asking for, right? It doesn't sound like, these are outrageous demands. Has there been any indication that management is willing to sit back down at the table with you on some of these issues?
They said they will meet with us again, but up till now, their position has been adamant that they are not going to provide paid sick leave, which, as you note, is something that employers all around the country provide. I would also note that the railroads when there was an executive order on a vaccine mandate, said they were federal contractors, therefore subject to that mandate, but they're not. There's also an executive order for employers who are federal contractors to provide paid sick leave, and the railroads say they're not subject to that, and they don't want to provide it. And really, this, I think, at this point is sort of a basic human need that people need to be able, and it's good for the railroads. You don't want sick people coming to work and infecting their coworkers.
Right.
It's not just for the benefit of the individual involved. And the railroads seem, again, recognize that during the beginning of the pandemic, but they won't provide it on a permanent basis.
So the union you represent is one of 12, though. I presume the other 11 are on board with this deal, and if so, and I know you guys are supportive of each other and representative of each other, what are the chances that we could see a strike here?
So several of the other unions, including the engineers and conductors that I mentioned, are still involved in the ratification process, and they're still voting, and we won't know what their members say in the end for a little while. But rail union workers, they stick together. Rail workers honor picket lines. If one of the unions strikes, everybody will honor the picket line. There's also the potential that the railroads would lock out. They were the last ones to cause a national disruption in 1992. They locked out railroad workers. So there is the potential. Again, we want to sit down and try and come to terms, and we hope we will, but that is part of the Railway Labor Act process. In the end, the possibility of self-help by either the union or management, and the pressure that is brought to bear by that possibility of self-help is part of the process. And again, we hope we don't have to be there, but there is that potential. And I would emphasize that unions are democratic institutions. Their members have the ultimate say. Union leadership will negotiate tentative agreements. We were presented with a presidential emergency board report. The union did what it could to try and improve it and put it in front of the membership. And they're the ones who have the ultimate say and will ultimately have the ultimate say.
Richard, is the White House still involved at all? And is there anything that you think the federal government can do to ensure that railroad workers are satisfied?
I think the White House is certainly, as my understanding, has offered to help however they can. We've appreciated the help of the administration at various points along the way. And I think, railroads could be pressured to share with their employees and treat their employees with respect, and not be as disdainful as they have been, both in bargaining and at the presidential emergency board proceedings.
Well, one thing we know for sure, the president is definitely watching this closely. We know he's a fan of the railroads, right? He's a fan of this form of transportation. So whether or not he weighs in, we know he's watching closely.
Richard Edelman, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
Not just that, Tanya, but we are bucking up against the midterm election.